Hi, it's Chantel here from Fiberific. And this week we're going to talk about stitch markers. Now, there are so many different types of stitch markers. I've just grabbed a selection of my stitch markers. Now, I know it's hard to believe, but there are different stitch markers that you would use for crochet and different stitch markers that are suitable for knitting. All stitch markers can be used for knitting, but not all stitch markers can be used for crochet. Because in the nature of the crochet stitches, if you put a stitch marker in a stitch, you're going to either have to completely undo the stitch to get it out or have a stitch marker that comes undone, like one of these lockable stitch markers. Where do we start? Let's start with the clean table. So the first thing is the stitch markers that we all start with are these little rings. Now I've got a few more here, I think. Oh yeah, there's a little one. Now the thing with these rings is they're not inherently bad. But what I found for me was that they constantly fell out of my project. So they didn't do their job. So I don't even know why I still have these. I had to dig around a bit to find them, but I never ever use them. I find that they're unreliable and my stitching time is precious. I don't want to be spending time fixing mistakes that shouldn't have been made if a stitch marker had been in the right place. So let's get rid of those. They're gone in the bin. Okay. The next kind of stitch markers we're going to look at are these little lockable stitch markers. So these little lockable stitch markers, they look like little padlocks and you can put them onto your project and then do them up. So they work in the same way, except they won't come undone and they won't create tears. No one wants tears in knitting. So I tend to use these particular types of stitch markers for just about all of my crochet projects. And also if I need to put a stitch into, like, say you're working on a jumper and it says, okay, now work 6 inches from here. I will pop a stitch marker, one of these lockable ones, in just around a random stitch on the row. And that way I can just measure from that stitch marker every time I want to check where I'm up to. And then when I'm finished, I can just pull it out. Easy peasy. Sometimes these stitch markers, they're a little bit big. They're a little bit, they're a little bit thick. And if you're working on some fine work and you don't want to pull stitches or things like that, there's an alternative. There's these little guys. And what they basically are is little tiny coilless safety pins. They're really, really small and they're fantastic. And both of those guys can absolutely be used for any knitting projects or any crochet projects. Now, there is nothing wrong with using dangly stitch markers, and I love dangly stitch markers. They're so cute. I got given this gift of these dangly stitch markers, which someone handmade for me using beautiful, beautiful polymer clay, and they embedded little stones into them, and they put them on this loop, and they're so gorgeous, and I love them. But not all projects can use the dangly stitch markers. If you're going to be using some nice thick yarn and you'll be needing, say, a jumper or a beanie or something like that, where you just need 1 or 2 stitch markers for the end or beginning of row if you're working in circular, or just something to remind you to do something, they'll be fine. They'll be they'll be fun to use, and they look awesome hanging off your projects, which is why we want them, because who doesn't want a little cake or an ice block or a skull face or something like that hanging off their projects? It's part of you. It's things that you like into your project. Or even these gorgeous little cute worms. Look at this little worm. He's so happy. Dangly stitch markers are fantastic if you're doing larger projects with larger yarns and larger items. And you don't need as many of them, because what can happen is they can get caught at the back of your knitting and then you've got to untangle them. And sometimes, especially with fine yarn, it's not always a fun process. So I tend to keep my big danglies for my big yarn. Wow. I tend to keep my dangly stitch markers for my thicker yarn projects. Now, it may seem that I am a stitch marker bossy person about what you can and can't use. At the end of the day, it's your knitting and you can use whatever you want. But my go-to stitch markers are my blinglets for a couple of reasons. I'm not sure if you can see there, but there's no seam. There's no way for your yarn to get caught inside the stitch marker, which means less work for you. There's no way for that little bead to get caught in your knitting, which is less work for you. There's a few different little sizes and you want to pick the right size for your needles. And sometimes bigger is just a bit better because they'll fit on more needles and into more projects. I really love the blinglets because they don't tangle, they don't get in the way, and they look gorgeous in your projects. They just sparkle. The blinglets are perfect for your lace knitting projects where you've got lots of yarn overs and things like that. They may move to either side of a yarn over, but that's really easy just to slip them back. This was my little talk on stitch markers, that all stitch markers are good, that just some stitch markers can't be used for everything. I had a conversation at the Craft and Quilt Fair with a few different people about my lace knitting. I had some shawls and things up on display, and I had some discussions with people over using stitch markers at all. Some people felt very passionate that they felt that stitch markers were only used by people who couldn't follow a pattern properly or couldn't read their own knitting. Now, I can't disagree more. I think stitch markers are an absolute amazing resource or tool, and if you can't get your hands on some cute little stitch markers like what I've got here, then use some string, use a contrasting yarn in a similar weight as to what you're working with. Now, the reasons why I love stitch markers and I use them in just about every project that I work on is that it means that I can focus on knitting and or crocheting and just put it down and walk away and go and do the things that I have to do throughout the day, and then walk back to my knitting or crochet project when I've got a moment and just start working again. I don't have to think about where I'm up to because I went to a stitch marker, and then I look at my pattern and I go, oh right, from here I do this. So yes, learning how to read your lace knitting and learning how to read your knitting and crochet and working out exactly where you're up to, that is an absolute amazing skill to learn, and I think everyone should learn it. I think that making people not use stitch markers when they're learning to knit or crochet or whatever they're making actually hinders their progress. I think that if you've got confidence that you don't have to worry about too many things at once, that you can focus on getting your knit or crochet stitches correct, and you don't have to worry about, have I gone too far? Do I have enough stitches? Do I have to get all the way to the end of a row to work out that I've done the wrong thing? Or can I just get to this little section and realize, hang on a second, I botched something back there, and you can go back 6 or 7 stitches instead of 200 stitches. This was my little tirade rant about stitch markers and blinglets and using every tool in your arsenal to help make your knitting and crochet journey a lot more exciting and a lot more fun, because at the end of the day, this is our hobby. This is what we love to do, and if it becomes hard work and it becomes stressful to do, you're going to put it down and you're going to go and find something else to do. We need projects like this. We need people to understand that use every tool that you can to help your progress along. Thank you for liking, commenting and subscribing. It's time for you to fill your universe with fibre fun. Off you go. I'll see you next time. Bye.